In this video, we're going to look at nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts are a mechanical method that's been developed over a very long time to hold two surfaces together. We've looked a little bit at bolts already, but let's have a look at how nuts work in conjunction with a bolt. Just as you need to define your bolt, you need to define your nut. You've got to have a matching nut to work with your bolt. To talk about nuts and bolts meaningfully, we need to know the names of the parts of the nuts and bolts. The parts of a nut and bolt are split up like this: the head, the body, the nut, and the thread. The thread is this helical part here. Now, it's the thread that I want to spend a little bit of time looking at. It's been quite tricky finding a set of colors that will bring out the contrast of the shape of the thread, but I think I've got an okay combination here. Here, you can see the shape of the thread is a V shape. Now, it's the thread that I want to look at a little bit closely here. The thread has component names as well. This part of the thread here, this little pointy part that exists periodically, this is the crest of the thread. This part in here at the bottom, that's called the root of the thread. The distance between two crests of the thread is called the pitch size. The angle in here, this angle here, is called the thread angle. The last two sizes to think about are the two outside diameters of the thread. That is, the bigger diameter and the smaller diameter. For a bolt, you normally measure the outside diameter to be the diameter of your bolt. The pitch size, that is the distance between the two crests of the bolt, this is the distance between this crest and this crest. You can measure that. After all, we need to know that measurement. So if we just measure that distance there, we can see that that is something like a 3.3 mil thread, but that's not very accurate. So what you can do is you can count out 10 threads and divide that number by 10 to give you a bit more accuracy. So let's count that out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's 10 spacings. And if we measure that out, let's have a quick measure. That's 3.07 millimeters. So it's actually something closer to a 3 mil thread. There are these little gauges that you can get. That look like this. And each of the little leaves in the gauge have a number or a size of some kind written on them. You can see here, this is the number for a Whitworth thread. And this here, this is the number for a metric thread. So if we have a look at that size, we would expect that to fit nicely in that thread because it's a 3 mil thread. Let's see what happens if we try and match a 2.5 mil thread. See, it doesn't match. Why do we care about the names of the parts of the thread? Well, because the thread on your bolt has to match the thread on your nut. And if the thread on your bolt doesn't match the thread on your nut, it won't tighten. To tighten a nut and bolt, you need two things. You need the tool to hold this end and the tool to hold this end. In this case, you need a M10 socket or spanner. Here's a spanner, and you could use the ring part of the spanner to hold the nut and another spanner to hold the head of the bolt. You don't have to use the ring end, of course, you can use the C end. Perhaps you've got a different type of nut and bolt like this. This is a PZ2 pan head, so you'll need a posi drive screwdriver to hold the pan head. And of course, you're going to need the spanner to hold the nut. In the case of this, you'll need the appropriate Allen key to hold the head, and of course, a spanner to hold the nut. Most commonly, you'll probably have a nut and bolt like this with a hex head and a hex nut. You can use a socket driver to hold the head, and the socket driver works like this. It will turn in one direction only. Remember, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. You can change the direction of that socket by flipping this little switch here. That now makes it turn the opposite direction. It can't turn back. To release the socket from the driver, some have a locking mechanism. Mostly that's a button that you press on the back to release the mechanism. In this cutaway, you can see how the thread of the bolt matches the thread of the nut. Now, as you tighten the nut, eventually what's going to happen is that there's going to be a force that's pushed this way. This face here of the inside of the thread of the nut is going to push against this face here on the inside of the thread. And that force cumulatively across the length of the nut and bolt is going to hold the nut against the bolt, against the surface, and hold everything together. It's just friction. There are a few things that you can do to strengthen this. There are some chemicals that you can get that you can put onto the nut and bolt thread, and as you're tightening it up, the chemical will harden and give an extra bit of resistance between the nut and bolt. These chemicals lock the nut and bolt together. This brand is called Loctite. It's quite a good thing to use in situations where you really don't want that nut and bolt to accidentally come undone. Of course, something else in this situation that you can use is one of these nuts. This nut is called a nylock nut, and that little rubber insert there provides excellent adhesion between the thread on the nut and the bolt. They're really only meant to be used once, but as you tighten up the nylock nut, this rubber part here will change shape and stop any vibration working the nut and bolt loose. Another chemical that you might want to use on the thread of a nut and bolt is a product like this. This product, under high temperatures, prevents the thread from rusting and the threads binding together because it's rusted tight. Well, now you know nearly everything there is to know about nuts and bolts. Go and bolt something together.